Hello everybody out there. Come on in here and we're going to have a little bit of Bible study here on this Wednesday night service on this great online church family that we're all a part of. So we're going to be talking some more about the Battle of Armageddon. So get your pencils and your paper and your Bibles out, and we're going to go try to finish up chapter 16. This makes the fourth part on 16, but there's lots of information. And like I always say, inch by inch, it's a cinch. And this is the problem with a lot of folks. They want to understand the book of Revelation, but in order to understand it, you've got to know what it's saying concerning a lot of issues, and it encompasses the rest of the Bible as such. So inch by inch, it's a cinch, and we've come a long way in our study on Revelation. We're in chapter 16 at the end of it with the seventh angel with the bowl judgments. I'm still here without my laptop computer, so I'm having to turn around. Please forgive me about that. But they say they've got it fixed. All I got to do is go pick it up. But it's been so bad weather till I haven't been able to here in the last few days. Good to see everybody out in the house here tonight, from Georgia to Alaska, and every points in between. Good to see everybody. Our newcomers on, people coming on all the time, our old members, down in Georgia and Louisiana, and especially here in Arkansas. We've got several that's been on here since day one, and I really appreciate that. I really appreciate your support and your prayers in all this, and it's been quite a journey. Next month will be March, and I think I started this either the first week in April or the last week in March. I have to go back and look. But we're almost a year into this online Bible study. So, I mean, and we're only on chapter 16, but we haven't got much further to go on this. And that don't mean that when we get through, we'll discontinue on Wednesday night. We're gonna be studying probably in the book of Daniel, and if somebody comes up with something different, I may even teach on the book of Corinthians or so. And I may just stay with this end time Bible study with the book of Joel, the book of Zechariah, the book of Hosea, Isaiah. So I may just continue this throughout anyway. So anyway, good to see everybody out. So we're going to get right into this here on this Wednesday night service. And I'm going to be starting at verse 17, because if I backtrack, I'm going to run out of time to finish up here tonight. So, and don't forget, all of the videos are archived on Facebook for all of our newcomers coming on, and all the everything is archived on YouTube, on the YouTube channel, New Beginnings Outreach Ministries, Pastor Tim Jordan. I know that's kind of long, but you'll see me on there as such, if they hadn't deplatformed me. So anyway, good to see everybody out. So I'm going to start with Revelation chapter 17. I guess I better, because I'm going to be going to the book of Joel just in a few minutes. But in Revelation 16, my hands is dry and the book's pages are dry. Verse 17, and the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air. So this illustration of this angelic beings, remember, there's 7 churches and 7 seals and 7 trumpets, judgments, and this is the 7 angels with the bowls of wrath, and this is the 7th angel, which gives us the clue that this is getting down to the end of the Great Tribulation. And like last week, I brung up the fact that all kinds of things are going to be issued into this Battle of Armageddon type situation through famine and lack of water. The sun's going to have, we're going to have sun issues, we're going to have weather phenomenon issues, external threats from meteorites and asteroids. That goes back to Revelation chapter 8, and then it goes back to the formulation of this one world government, and this one world antichrist system is fighting against God just like they are today. So there's lots of issues that is piling up with these bowls of wrath, and God is not going to allow this stuff to go on forever. He's going to step in one of these days. But he says here, and he poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, "It is done." Now I find this fascinating. It says, this temple in heaven. This is an illustration that goes back into the Old Testament with the tabernacles, the temple of Solomon. Why is there always a temple somewhere that's being made? Because it's supposed to illustrate as such here on the earth, like Solomon's temple, and I addressed that back into one of my former videos about the temple as such, and it's to represent God here on the earth. The temple is whatever is here on the earth constructive, just like it was with the tabernacle in the wilderness. God gave Moses specific instructions on how to build. They just didn't have a church meeting and says, we need to build a building out here, and let's make it like this, and let's be cost effective, and we need to have some restrooms in it, and so on and so forth. That's not the way it happened. God introduced into Moses specific how he wanted the tabernacle, and this is all reflective of things in heaven. And so if you was in Moses' time, that would be a reflection of things that would be in heaven. Now when it came to Solomon, same type scenario, God introduced into Solomon, this is how I want this to be built, with the priesthood and the elders and things. This is how I want it to build. I want this building, and I want 2 big giant columns out in front, and I want this, and I want a gold Ark of the Covenant. I want it in a special place. I want this menorah here. Why is all this? Because it's reflective of the things that's in heaven. And so, and then I expressed when we was going across that, remember, now they're talking about a tribulation temple, and it's going to be built. Well, this is supposed to be a reflection of things in heaven here on the earth, and that's why the enemy doesn't want a temple being built for the Jewish community, because they're anti-God anyway. But if you have a temple built for the Jewish nation of Israel, then that's reflected of God's nature here on the earth, and this one world government, they don't want a reflective nature here on earth. They want their nature, not God's nature. So this is why that when the temple is going to be built in Jerusalem, that there's all going to be all kinds of stuff that's going to break loose, and then there's going to be a treaty that's going to be dissolved, and then Israel is going to have to go into hiding. They're going to have to go into the wilderness, and the abomination of desolation is going to be setting himself up. This Antichrist figure is going to set up a figurehead inside of the temple as he is God here on the earth, not Jehovah God. That's what the big contention is even today, is about God here on the earth. And this is why Israel has been tormented for centuries, because they're God's people, and the world doesn't want God's people to exist. And now they're turning their faces upon Christianity, and they don't want Christianity either, see? So in actuality, the battle has already begun in the spirit realm as such, but it's going to end in the physical one of these days. So, and in verse 18, and there was noises and thunderings and lightnings. Now these voices and thunders and lightnings are from a spiritual nature. Remember what we went over several weeks ago about the seven thunders of God, that they was prophetic in nature, and God listened to what they said, but God told John, or the angel of the Lord told John, do not write this down, but you can only you can ponder it in your heart. And John had to carry those thunderings in his life. And you say, well, I must have missed that. Well, what the seven thunders was the rest. It kind of like Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. But it also shows God's sovereignty. Even in His wrath, there is God's sovereignty. Instead of complete annihilation, then God comes to a certain part and says, here's where I'm going to stop with the judgment, and here's where I'm going to proceed further into establishing my kingdom here on the earth. But the seven thunders, I believe, constituted a far greater judgment than what God wanted to issue. So, with all that said, it could be a lot worse. But God, even in His sovereign, even in His judgments, is going to be better than what it would have been if He had just poured out His complete annihilation on a lot of people, you know. So, and these noises and thunderings and lightnings, and we was reading from the book of Enoch, if you remember that the lightnings, that Enoch was allowed to see where the lightnings lived at. You go, what? You know, where they lived at and what they said. You know, so if you want to go back to the book of Enoch, that's very fascinating reading there as well. But these are from a spiritual nature. This is not from the physical, you know, like the thunderstorm comes and we see lightnings and thunders and stuff, which that's representative, but this is talking about a spiritual from around God's throne as such. So kind of remember that when we get into a thunderstorm and we have lightnings and thunders, just kind of remember this is what's going on around God's throne, and they're making declarations in the spirit, in the heavenlies to mankind, you know. So that's some more of this deep calling to the deep type stuff. But noises, in Old King James it says voices, which is the same type thing. Voices and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake. There's going to be the earthquake. That we have earthquakes, but this is going to be the earthquake that's really going to shake mankind. And this is one of this last wrath call of God, and and even in the book of Isaiah, it talks about the earth shaking and a quaking. Even in the book of Isaiah, I think that's chapter 24, that he's going to shake the earth for what it is, you know. So, and a great earthquake, such as mighty a earthquake. Remember this idea, if things are mentioned twice in the same sentence, God is bringing our attention to that. Remember where Jesus says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you," or in some of the newer translation, it says, you know, Alzheimer moment. Verily, 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 or truly, 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 I say unto you. Anytime things are mentioned twice like that, like it says in this verse here about earthquakes, you really have to pay specific attention to that, because he's drawing our eyes to a particular time in the future, that there is going to be one earthquake that's going to outstand everything else. See, and so he says here, a mighty earthquake has not occurred since men were on the earth. I'm telling you, in 6,000 years, this will be the earthquake that's going to change the world now. And then we're going to get into this islands fleeing and mountains being leveled and stuff. And it says here in verse 19, "And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell." The cities of the nations, that means New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, Miami. That's just here. Well, Tokyo, Mexico City. You just think of how many millions of people that live in those. Johannesburg, South Africa. Cairo, Egypt. Moscow, Paris, France, Frankfurt, Germany, Rome, especially Rome, So all of these mega cities, it says here that the cities of the nations fell during this upheaval in the earth's realm. So that, I'm telling you, that is it's going to be shaking and a quaking, So, and great Babylon was remembered before God to give up her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. He's not forgetting what has been done to the innocent. He's not forgetting of the things in the past. God, Yahweh, doesn't forget nothing, And so he's going to declare in his sovereignty, yes, these things are coming, but I'm going to make a new heaven and a new earth. I'm going to rule and reign. The Antichrist is going down, and I'm not going to forget about what they have done to the innocents. I'm not going to forget what lawmakers are doing about genocide of the infants. I'm not going to forget the Holocaust. I'm not going to forget this. See, a lot of people, they think that when you pass on from here and go on, well, que sera, sera. But I got news. God doesn't forget nothing. So, let me back up here on these. In some older commentaries, it's amazing as time progresses that revelation and prophecy also increases with time, and we know more and more than even what Joel and some of the prophets in the Old Testament had, even the Bible declares that they would have loved to have seen some of the things that would come to pass that they had prophesied in their time. And we're living there, and every day it brings out more and more and more about prophecy and about more understanding. It's just like the newspaper. Every day we become more and more fixated on the things of God, and it's bringing this word to life every day. And I'm going to get to some stuff here in a little bit. For some older commentaries, that's commentaries 150 years ago, they couldn't possibly have known what we know today. They was just making conjectures on trying to put 1 and 1 is 2. But we're living in a day and a time that we're seeing things come about in the Bible that no other generation could even fathom about what's taking place. And we're here. We're here. And some older commentaries wants to supersede this as being the old Babylon city, this where the great city was divided. They always said it was the old Babylonian city of Babylon going to rise, and it's going to be divided. But we know better today than they did back then, because Jerusalem is already divided as such. Old Babylon city, but no city has been in more wars than Jerusalem. Why is that? If you go back and you start studying way back at Joshua and Jericho, even Abraham, God told Abraham to get out of Ur, and that's Babylon. So God told Abraham to get out of Babylon a long time ago. Even Babylon, God visited Babylon and created this speech issue where they couldn't even communicate with each other. And then Joshua invades the land of Canaan and to try to get rid of the occupants in Canaan. And then as Nebuchadnezzar's dad ruled and reigned before him, they captured Israel. And then Nebuchadnezzar came and captured Judah. And then they was all brung from Jerusalem to Babylon. And then Cyrus allowed the Israelites to go back to Jerusalem to reestablish the temple and to reestablish Israel or Judah. And then you had, that was in the Persian, and then you had Alexander the Great comes around, and we discussed the Maccabees with the menorah, with the Hanukkah menorah. Remember that back there in Christmas? And so they're fighting in Jerusalem again. And then when Alexander the Great passed away, and then you had the Caesars in Rome, then they're coming at the time of Christ, and they're battling. And then Rome came and destroyed the temple in 70 AD. And then after that, you had the Muslims. They run in and captured Jerusalem and held it till 1000 AD. And it's just been a skirmish in one way or the other. Then England was kind of overseeing. The British Empire was trying to oversee what they called Palestine, but it never was Palestine. It was always God's place, but it never was Palestine. And so, in the British Empire pretty well roughshod that with the Balfour Agreement back in the early 1900s. So it's just been a battle. And then Germany came, and then the Holocaust came, The United Nations declared Israel in 1948 as a sovereign nation. Then they started the Arab Wars the day after that. And they've been fussing and fighting. And then Israel pretty well settled it in 1967. But the United Nations remember, the United Nations has filed against Israel for years and years and years, and now they're talking about this two-party state, which that's not going to work. So I said all that to say this: there's been this turmoil in that region for years and years and years, and it's an external. It's not coming from the inside as such. It's always an external issue that's coming there. Why? Because that is God's proving ground, and that gets back to this spirituality of these nations wanting to get rid of God, get rid of the Jews, get rid of this, get rid of that. So, and the Jews are still here, the Jewish nation's still here, and those nations is bankrupt and went on to the happy hunting ground wherever a nation goes to. But and today's revelation shows us more and more as time progresses. Daniel describes the colossal statue of Nebuchadnezzar as future empires coming against Israel, with Persia, Greek, and Roman, along with the Babylonian, and now with the 10 toes, of iron clay. That's this revived Holy Roman Empire type issue. And so this is all coming. Jerusalem has been divided in the past by Rome, Christian wars, and the Turks. That's what I was talking about. Turkey, it took over that as the Ottoman Empire years ago, and they lost their sovereignty. And the British Empire pretty well took over after them. So it's been in a fuss and a fight all these years. Today, Jerusalem is divided into three. That's what it talks about here. In verse 19, it says, "And the great city was divided into three parts." Well, who would have known back during the Baldur Declaration, and who would have known back in 1948 the sovereignty of Israel? Who would have known if you was a Bible commentator there and says, "Oh, by the way, in 2 or 3 years, it's all going to be divided up"? They would have never known that. But see, even today, in the heart of Jerusalem, it's divided up into three. It's divided up with the Christian sect, the Orthodox Christians. It's set up by the Orthodox Jewish community, and it's also set up by the Muslim community. The Dome of the Rock on top of the temple, and then Israel has the Wailing Wall, and then downtown with the sepulchre site is supposed to be kind of overseen by the Orthodox Christian, which is AKA the Catholics and the Orthodox Christian. It gets kind of confusion. The Orthodox Christian community came out of the Catholic Church. It was separated back during Constantine, and that's why that the Orthodox Christian is there, along with, you might say it's divided up four, but us being Protestant Christians, we have access in and out. We have more access than even some of the Muslim sites, because us being outsiders, we can even go up on the Temple Mount as such, and we can go where the Jewish community can't go, but we can go where the Jewish can, So it's already divided up into such. I don't know why I need to tell this, but there was I think it was outside of the sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity there, and somebody had left a broom laying up against the wall somewhere. And that broom had been laying up against that wall for hundreds of years. It was like 100 or 200 years. And somebody asked them, why was that? Oh, it's holy. That broom is holy. And, well, why don't we put it somewhere? Oh, we can't touch it. And then they had made a big committee to find out where it come from, and they pulled all of the rabbis and they pulled all of the priests together and all the Christians together and made up this big committee to find out what it was going to do about this broom. And then they finally figured out that, well, it didn't fall under that jurisdiction, and they didn't want to fall under this jurisdiction, and the Muslims didn't leave it there. And so somebody just picked it up and put it in a broom closet or whatever it was. It was kind of comical, but they was so scared that it was going to create this skirmish if I moved that broom. And it's a volatile situation over there still. Everybody's just sitting on pins and needles. They can't do this and can't do that, you know. And they had this big orchestrated meeting over a broom, you know. So that was kind of a little bit much. Let me go to the book of Joel while I'm talking about the Battle of Armageddon here. And this is, if anybody wants to know about the Battle of Armageddon, Joel was pretty well one that was getting as close to it as he could with a revelation in his time. And it is simply amazing. In the book of Joel, chapter 3, it says, for behold, let's see, Joel chapter 3, verse 1. For behold, in those days, and at that time, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem. See, we're already living in a day and a time, and I mentioned it last week, that the Jewish nation is returning back to Israel. Well, they started back in 1948 after the Holocaust, because they was scattered throughout the world with persecution. And in the book of Joel it says, and I will bring them back. I will bring back my nation. In any other time in history, you say, well, 1948, that's been a pretty good while back. Yeah, but on the scope of human existence, it's just a vapor. And God says, in the later times, I'm going to start bringing my people back. This will be a sign. This will be a sign that the people will start returning back to Israel. Well, we're already seeing that, and like I said last week, Israel has got a law. If you want to claim sovereign citizenship to Israel, they will pay you a ticket to get there. You know, so that's biblical in itself. And then we have the capital moved to Jerusalem from Haifa. See, so you have a capital, and the first thing you're going to have is a temple one of these days. But people will say, oh, well, that's just coincidence. No, it's far from coincidence. But he says, I will bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, and I will also gather all nations to bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And I've got another place here in verse 12. I'm going to get back to that. And he says, I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people. Now, in the book of Joel here, he's telling us that there's going to be a judgment coming, and he's going to judge the nation because of his people. He's still calling them his people here. Even with the ups and the downs of the nation of Israel, he says, I'm going to judge the nations on how they treated my people. You know, And he says, on the account of my people, my heritage, Israel. That's God's heritage now. And he says, whom they have scattered among the nations, for they have divided up my land. Now that goes, that gets back to this two-state solution stuff. And I think that's going to be a crying shame if they ever even start in on that again. But they're not going to divide up much, because God is about all of the dividing. He's going to divide up. And so, now listen to this. I haven't got it here in my notes, but I'm going to read this anyway. They have cast lots for my people. They have given a boy in exchange for a harlot, and sold a girl for wine that they may be drunk. Well, that sounds like a lot of this human trafficking. Well, we're already seeing that, but see, the nations are doing this. See, let me skip on down here to verse 9. In verse 9, because if I read all of this, we're going to run out of time. But I encourage you to read that and study it. In verse 9, proclaim this among the nations. Prepare for war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near, and let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords. Some people has heard about that verse, but really didn't know where it was or what it was about. He says, there's coming to a time that peace is not going to be in the land, that it's going to be war. Remember what it says in Thessalonians, peace and safety and then sudden destruction? Well, he says here, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong. Assemble and come, all you nations, and gather together all around. Cause your mighty ones to go down there, O Lord. Let the nations be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, I've read that twice about Jehoshaphat. And you say, what does that have to do with King Jehoshaphat? Well, I'm glad you asked, because it's one of those inside information deals that triggers this, because it says the valley of Jehoshaphat. Well, if you dig into the word Jehoshaphat, the King Jehoshaphat's name is the judgment of the Lord. So it's kind of like one of those little small clues is to bring this into reality of future events. It leaves it not at the day of Joel, at the Roman and the Greek and the Persian empires, but it's a future day in the valley of decision, or the valley of Jehoshaphat, which means the judgment of the Lord. So you can say that, let the nations be weakened and come up from the valley of the judgment of the Lord. Well, there's only one valley of the judgment of the Lord, and that's the valley of Megiddo, which is Armageddon. So there's only one. So that's what this is talking about. And he says, and there I'll set to judge all the surrounding nations. I'll sit on the judgment seat. And he says, put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. So, let me get a little bit further along here. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Now, isn't that what we discussed in the last chapter? In the bowls of wrath, that he commanded one of the angels to thrust in his sickle because the harvest is ripe, and to mash the grapes which was representing the judgment of the blood up to the horse's bridle. And Joel talks about put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. And he says, go down for the wine press. See, that eliminates, well, what harvest? Well, what do you harvest when there's a wine press? That's in this later time. This goes back to Yom Kippur. This goes back to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. The Atonement Day of the Lord, the Day of Atonement. See, these are the times and the seasons that we know about in Bible study, that the Day of Atonement is the day of judgment that Israel went to the tabernacle once a year to confess their sins for the blessing to come for the following year. Well, that's what this is talking about. Judgment is coming, and for the ones that are blessed, we're going to be blessed for the coming millennium to come. Yeah. So that's why it's so important for us to understand the feast days of the Lord, to understand why did God institute those feast days, to give us a heads up on things to come. Okay, so he says here, for the winepress is full and the vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Now we're going to get into this on the next chapter, why the harlot that rides the beast is drunken with the blood of the saints. See, it's overflowing with the wickedness of the harlot in next chapter, in chapter 17. But Joel is addressing this. He says, the vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. And he says here in verse 14, multitude in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. There again, it's mentioned twice. So we need to focus our little two beady eyes on this is the day of decision. This is it. This is over with. This is the last of the bowl judgment. We've read here in Revelation 16 that the seventh angel poured out his wrath into the air. Well, this is what is coming. And isn't it kind of funny that Jesus is coming in the air to judge the nation, and he throws the bowls up into the air for the judgment, and then judgment is coming with 10,000 saints one of these days? You got to put things together sometimes. Multitudes and multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon will grow dark. We've read that before. And you read it in Acts chapter 2 as well. And the stars will diminish their brightness. How would this happen? It will happen because of earthquakes and volcanoes, external threats, heat and fire and smoke is going to diminish the sun and the moon and the stars, and you're not going to be able to see them. Case in point, last year was a horrendous season in California, and if some of you are watching, you know what I'm talking about. The smoke gets up into the air and it just blocks out the sun. It blocks out the moon. It blocks out everything. It's like you're in the dark during the meantime. And the stars will diminish their brightness, and the Lord will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. Get a hold of what he's saying here. Is this a physical? I think so. I think when he sets his foot on the Mount of Olives, he's going to point his finger. And he says, and the Lord, and this is Yahweh, this is big L, capital Lord, and the Lord will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. The heavens and the earth will quake. Remember what I read there a while ago in Revelation, a great earthquake not known since the dawn of man. And he says here, the heavens and the earth quake, for the Lord will shelter, for the Lord will be a shelter for his people. See, this is what I keep saying. The people that recognize who the Lord is, the Lord's going to put his hand on them. They're not going to suffer the wrath of God. It's the nations that's going to suffer the wrath of God, not the people, not his people, not people that's being saved, people that's being delivered, people that's turned over, and people that has come through some of this stuff. Yeah, there's horrific events, there's martyrs and people that's killed, but there's they're going to be sheltered, they're going to be pushed through this whole ordeal. And it says here, and that's what it says, and the Lord will be a shelter for his people. Well, if there's no people left, why is he sheltering anything? And the strength of the children of Israel. So he goes on to say, so you shall know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. Then Jerusalem shall be holy, and no aliens or foreigners or strangers shall ever pass through her again. All this foolishness is going to stop. You know, it'll be God's people here on the earth. And so, in verse 18, and it will come to pass in that day that the mountains will drip with new wine. Oh, now we're getting into this New Jerusalem stuff now. He says, and it will come to pass in that day that the mountains will drip with new wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and the brooks of Judah shall be flooded with water, and a fountain shall flow from the house of the Lord. That sounds like Revelation chapter 21. And it says, and the water of the valley of the Achaeas, and in verse 19, and Egypt, let's see, 19, okay. 19, Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom a desolate wilderness. Now see, I discussed that last week about Edom, which that gets back to Iraq and Iran type area and Saudi Arabia. It says here they're going to be desolate. They're going to be done. You know, no more nuclear agreements, no more patting the books, no more sending money in private, in military airplanes for a big payoff, and none of this stuff. And it says, Egypt and Edom will be a desolate wilderness because of the violence against his people Judah. The news every day incurs about something that the Ayatollah Khomeini is wanting to wipe Israel off of the map, or there's another nation, wanting to wipe Israel off of the map. Egypt is wanting to do something with Israel. Turkey is wanting to do something with Israel. Syria is wanting to do something with Israel. Lebanon is going to do something with Israel. But it says here that for they have, he says, because of violence against the people of Judah, and they have shed innocent blood in their land, but Judah shall abide forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. That gets back to this millennial reign and this new Jerusalem coming down. From generation to generation will declare the glory of the Lord in their generation. See, and he says, and I will acquit them of blood guilt, for I had not acquitted, for the Lord dwells in Zion. So, I wanted to read all of that because it gives us a overall picture of the things coming according to Joel in his day. And he pretty well in chapter 3 told everything that was going to happen in these few verses of Scripture in the book of Revelation. And this is why I'm saying we know by things to come, we know of things that coming all the time, that it just keeps coming little by little, and little by little we understand more and more and more. In verse 20, let me move on here a little bit. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. Why? Because of this horrendous earthquake. And what has caused the earthquake? It could have been an asteroid. It could have been external forces from the sun, radiation from dark space. Anything that comes around could trigger this. And it's what God has already wrote in His Word. These are things that's going to happen here. And He says, and there fell upon men a great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent. Can't you imagine a hailstone weighing 100 pounds? I was watching a program the other day, and they was talking about somewhere in Africa, I think South Africa, they had like a 2 or 3 pound, 3 or 4 or 5 pound hail, and I think there was a place in Oklahoma that had like a 5 or 8 pound chunk of ice. Now you just think about 8 pound, a gallon of milk. That's just 8 pound. You know, if it fell out to hit you in the head, it'd kill you. What would it take for 2 sacks of feed, the weight of 2 50-pound sacks of feed falling out of the sky? It would just decimate everything, you know, except for maybe concrete. But this gets back to the story about men will hide themselves in caves. There's going to be this weather-related phenomenon, and I've been listening to this fellow on news at night, and I think he's fairly educated and knows what he's talking about. And he's talking about over these last several years that the atmospheric conditions are being compressed on the earth. Our stratosphere is being compressed on the earth by outside radiation waves, that it's going to start compressing and compressing and compressing, and with that compression becomes more volatile pressures, and this is why we have the jet stream coming all the way to Brownsville, Texas, you know, in the last few days. That's why we got subarctic phenomenons, is this compression of this atmosphere that compresses, and the waves of the jet stream are being pushed more to the ground. Remember, let's look at this. If you're in a jet airliner and you're flying at 30,000 feet, and you're sitting there in your shirt sleeves and you're reading a magazine at a jetliner at 30,000 feet, why is there ice building up on the wings at 30,000 feet? Because the coldness, because all of that atmospheric pressure is not as much as it is here, down here on the earth. That's what creates lift in an airplane and so on and so forth. Well, if you brung, that's why in World War II, in a B-17, you see Hogan's Heroes, they've got those big, thick Air Force jackets on. That's not for just Hogan's Heroes. They said that in a B-29, they had to have oxygen on because they was flying at altitudes, 20, 25, 30,000 feet. And they said if you took your hand and stuck it to the side of that metal on an airplane, that your hand would be automatically froze to that airplane. And they was constantly being aware of the cold being on that metal in those B-17 bombers. It's extremely cold. Well, if you took all that cold and you started pressing it down to the earth, what would it take for our atmosphere to start being decompressed? External forces beyond our control. It's not climate change or stuff. The radiation from the sun is already increased, and they don't tell that on the news. Radiation is increased all the time. And with all this, it decompresses. Well, that cold starts pushing down to the earth, and then you have the jet streams, and then the first thing you know, you've got a tornado, or you've got some weather phenomenon that's tied up in a cold front somewhere. It wouldn't be very far stretched to say that you'd have huge ice chunks to start forming. And I think somebody said that the winds would be like 300 miles an hour just to uplift a hailstone that big. Well, we already got tornadoes that's over 200 miles an hour. So, folks, we're getting there. So, let's see here. Every stone about the weight of a talent, and men blaspheme God because of the plague of the hail. Well, if they curse God, they can also say, God, forgive me, for I have sinned. But they're not going to do that. And it says, for the plague thereof was exceedingly great. Now, John is calling this a plague. We perceive a plague as being sickness and disease, but he's saying, he's already declared here that plagues are wars and now weather phenomenons. In verse 18 states of a great earthquake. Verse 20 and 21 states of catastrophic events that will change the earth landscape. The covenant with Noah states that God will not destroy the nations with water. He quote, I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. Well, what is it going to be destroying the earth this next time? The Apostle Peter writes, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, and in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Remember what I said? We was reading about the Euphrates drying up, and men was going to be scorched. Well, when you got that, you have no water, no food. See? But it said, the Bible said in Joel chapter 3, I will take my hand and preserve my people. See? So, with fervent heat, and the earth also and the works that are therein are burned up. I used to work with a guy a long time ago on the mission field. And he said, well, it don't make any difference. It's all going to burn up anyway. And I said, yeah, but we got to work today, not after a while, But he said, oh, it's all going to burn up anyway. That was his excuse for everything. What does the fervent heat suggest? There are some possibilities. Major earthquakes are mentioned in some 16 times in the Bible. The crucifixion, the Philippian jailer, the book of Revelation besides what is mentioned in the Old Testament. So earthquakes and things are a phenomenon that happens routinely throughout the earth, but there's going to be one that's really going to be something one of these days. Major earthquakes. This was a picture of Alaska in 1964. Major earthquakes produce catastrophic events in which have been noticed in recent years in Mexico City, California, the San Andreas, very familiar. You have the one up in Seattle, the subduction zone. You have the New Madrid in 1811 and 1812. That's in the Boot Hill, Missouri, the New Madrid there. And earthquakes are also associated with volcanoes and tsunamis in Japan, Indonesia. Remember when a tsunami hit Indonesia and it killed 250,000 people, and the news media didn't even pick it up years ago. Unbelievable. It was a death, but after it's all said and done away with, there was completely whole societies that was washed away, and nobody even knew about it. And then we've got this in Japan. Remember that tsunami? And then Indonesia and around the world, volcanoes sets up atmospheric conditions that can be devastating to human existence. Pompeii erupted in AD 79. Remember, they're still digging that city out. And they're still finding all kinds of stuff that was from that volcano at Pompeii. It just buried a whole society. Just buried them. And so, in Revelation 8, the angel throws down fire from heaven to produce an earthquake. The fire is mixed with hail. In Revelation 8, fire is mixed with hail. So we've got a 100-pound hailstone that's hot. I don't know how that's going to work. The fire is mixed with hail. Remember, this is part of the plagues that Egypt experienced. It had hail mixed with fire in Egypt. Remember that? These are the same things. These are predecessors. The things that happened in Egypt is God is going to reveal them again, but in a bigger way than just in Egypt. He's going to do this in the world, on the world stage, not just in Egypt. And the fire was mixed with hail. The third angel sounded, and an asteroid named Wormwood, remember in Revelation 8, burning like a lamp, and many died of the waters that became bitter. So there's lots of issues that's going to take place one of these days, and we're already knowing about the asteroid Apophis that's coming in 2029. And they say it's going to skim by the earth. I don't think they have any idea. But see, that's not very long away. That's only 8 years away. You know, and I'm not saying this to frighten anybody, but what would you do if you knew that the world was coming to an end in 8 years? What would you do? What would you say? Where would you go? You ain't going nowhere. You can't get away. See, I said that to say this. In the book of Joel, he says, I'm going to put my hand on my people. Well, it says in Psalms 91, he that abideth in the shelter of the Almighty. We've got to abide in the shelter of the Almighty. See, so again, it's when we look at the Bible as a whole, it starts bringing home a whole new picture. Kind of a picture of Apophis here. And the third angel sounded as a star, asteroid named Wormwood, burning like a lamp, and many died of the waters became bitter. there will be many meteorites and asteroids coming near by NASA's report, times to come. And you can go on the NASA website, and they have all kinds of meteorites and asteroids flying by all the time. The fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun and the moon was blotted out. That goes back to this, ashes and volcanoes and stuff. How by asteroid and meteors hitting the earth causing atmospheric conditions which will heat the atmosphere with superheated particles, and also creates volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis. See, external forces that's beyond global science. Just ask the dinosaurs. Just ask them. With this, climate change is not by mankind, but by external forces. Al Gore is not running the show here. Will produce this 50 to 125 pound hailstone. This plague is referred to Exodus 9:13-25. That goes back to the hail and the fire as such. So, you know what? We're finished with chapter 16. There was lots that was in there. And it's lots to consider, that things are going to get considerably bad one of these days. And that the Lord is coming with 10,000 saints to execute judgment on the nations that persecutes His people. That's what chapter 16, the bottom line is. There's these places on the net, the bottom line. Well, the bottom line is God is going to execute judgment one of these days for His people, me and you, the innocent that's being killed, Israel that's being as such, and people to come, people that never got here through abortion. God is going to execute His judgment over all this foolishness one of these days. So get ready. So, and we've studied, and we're getting in some real stuff next week. We're going to be studying about the religious Babylon, and then in chapter 18, the commercial Babylon. But I'm going to give you a little heads up. I don't know if I'll get to it next week, but I'm going to warn you that we're going to get into some super heavy duty stuff about Easter and Christmas that's coming about, that I'm going to teach on, but I may not get there next Wednesday. But just fair warning, So, but God loves you, and me and Linda loves you, and we care about you. And I'm so glad for you to take out your precious time to come visit with us here on this Wednesday night Bible study, studying the in-depth studies of the book of Revelations. And when we get through, you'll be a scholar like everybody else. You can pat yourself on the back and say, I'm a scholar. Clarence, you can look at Molly and say, I'm a scholar. And then Molly will go, well, I'm a scholar too. I'm so glad for you to be. And Deborah, you've been with me all this time. You're a scholar too. So anyway, me and Linda love you. We care about you. This is why I'm doing this in-depth study, inch by inch, and it's a cinch. It gives us pause to think about some things, and it gives us a time to think about some of the stupid that people tries to get us to believe all the time. But God is coming one of these days. He said it too much. It's said too much in the Bible to turn back now. And I'm thank you for visiting with us. And like always, wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty and justice for all. Bye-bye, and God bless each and every one of you.